The
Will
sun
everything be
cast
all right?
long
It
shadows
will.
across the
I
dusty
promise you.
platform as Lillian Parker's heart sank to the soles of her worn leather boots. The train's whistle shrieked a final, mournful farewell as it pulled away from Cottonwood Springs, leaving nothing but a cloud of steam and broken promises in its wake. Her uncle, who had promised to meet her, was nowhere to be found, and the station had emptied as quickly as a saloon during a Sunday sermon. Tears stung Lillian's eyes as she clutched her valise tighter. The letter from her Uncle Wallace crumpled in her gloved hand. After her parents' deaths from influenza back in Boston, this remote Arizona town was supposed to be her fresh start in 1882. Now, as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the wooden platform, she felt utterly abandoned. "Looks like you've been stood up, miss," came a deep voice from behind her. Lillian turned, hastily wiping away a tear with the back of her glove. The man before her stood tall against the setting sun, his broad shoulders silhouetted beneath a well-worn Stetson. His eyes, the color of a summer storm, regarded her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "My uncle was supposed to meet me," she explained, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I've traveled all the way from Boston." The stranger nodded, removing his hat and revealing thick brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. "I'm Mason Blackwell," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Town sheriff, and I happen to know your Uncle Wallace." Lillian hesitated before placing her gloved fingers in his palm. "Lillian Parker. You know my uncle," Mason's expression shifted, a grimness settling over his features. "I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news, Miss Parker. Your uncle took ill with fever 3 days ago. He's being tended to at Doc Jenkins' place on the other side of town." The platform seemed to tilt beneath Lillian's feet. Her last living relative, the only connection she had left in the world, was ill. The prospect of facing another loss was unbearable. I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant sounds of the town. Mason replaced his hat, his eyes never leaving her face. He seemed to come to some decision as he looked at her standing alone, clutching her belongings. "There's a boarding house in town, but it's a fair walk from here," he said, then cleared his throat. "My ranch is closer, just outside town. I've got a spare room where you could stay until your uncle recovers." Lillian stared at him, trying to gauge his character. In Boston, a woman would never consider such an offer from a stranger. But this wasn't Boston, and she was alone in a town where the only person she knew lay ill. Mason seemed to sense her hesitation. "Mrs. Abernathy, my housekeeper, lives on the property. She's a respectable widow and would be there the whole time. I give you my word as sheriff that you'd be treated with nothing but respect." He extended his hand once more, his expression earnest. "Ride home with me, Miss Parker, at least until we can sort things out with your uncle." Something in his steady gaze made Lillian trust him. She placed her hand in his, feeling the strength in his fingers as they closed around hers. "Thank you, Sheriff Blackwell." "Mason," he corrected with a gentle smile. "Just Mason out here." He led her to where his horse was hitched, a magnificent chestnut stallion that pawed impatiently at the ground. With practiced ease, Mason secured her valise to the saddle before turning to help her mount. "I'm afraid we'll have to ride double. Thunderbolt here is strong enough for both of us." Before she could respond, his hands were at her waist, lifting her onto the horse as if she weighed nothing. Lillian found herself situated sideways on the saddle, her skirts arranged as modestly as possible. A moment later, Mason swung up behind her, one arm reaching around to take the reins. "Hold on tight, Miss Parker," he instructed as the horse began to move. Lillian had never been this close to a man who wasn't family. The heat of him at her back and the solid strength of his arm near her waist made her heart race in a most improper way. She clutched the saddle horn, acutely aware of every place their bodies connected. As they rode away from the station, the town of Cottonwood Springs spread out before them. Unlike the brick and mortar of Boston, the buildings were predominantly wood, with false fronts reaching toward the sky as if trying to appear more substantial than they were. People moved along the boardwalks, pausing to watch as the sheriff rode past with a strange woman. "Everyone's looking," Lillian whispered, embarrassment washing over her. Mason chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest and into her back. "News travels fast in a small town. By sundown, everyone will know you're Wallace Parker's niece from back east. Is that all they'll say?" She asked, thinking of her reputation. "They'll also say you're staying at the sheriff's ranch with Mrs. Abernathy keeping a proper eye on things," he replied, understanding her concern. "Your reputation is safe with me, Miss Parker." They rode past the edge of town, the buildings giving way to open landscape. The setting sun painted the distant mountains in hues of purple and gold, a sight so breathtaking that Lillian momentarily forgot her troubles. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "That it is," Mason agreed, though when she glanced back, his eyes weren't on the landscape but on her face. The ride took them through rolling grassland, past stands of cottonwood trees that gave the town its name. After 20 minutes, they crested a small rise, and Mason's ranch came into view, a modest but well-maintained house with a large barn and several corrals. "It's not much," Mason said, a note of apology in his voice, "but it's home." "It's lovely," Lillian replied honestly. After the cramped quarters she'd shared with 3 other seamstresses in Boston, the open space felt like a luxury. As they approached, a plump woman in her 50s emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face broke into a curious smile as she spotted Lillian. "Mrs. Abernathy," Mason called as he brought Thunderbolt to a halt. "We have a guest who will be staying with us for a time." Mason dismounted first, then reached up to help Lillian down. His hands spanned her waist easily as he lifted her to the ground. For a moment, they stood close, his hands lingering a second longer than necessary before he stepped back. "This is Miss Lillian Parker, Wallace's niece from Boston," Mason explained to Mrs. Abernathy. "Her uncle's taken ill and couldn't meet her train." Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened with understanding. "Oh, you poor dear. Come inside and we'll get you settled right away. I've just put a stew on for supper." As Mason took care of his horse, Mrs. Abernathy led Lillian into the house. The interior was simple but comfortable, with a large main room containing a stone fireplace and sturdy furniture. A corridor led to what Lillian presumed were bedrooms. "I'm afraid it's not what you're used to in Boston," Mrs. Abernathy said, showing Lillian to a small but clean bedroom. "It's perfect," Lillian assured her, "and I'm grateful for Sheriff Blackwell's kindness." Mrs. Abernathy smiled, a knowing twinkle in her eye. "Mason's a good man. One of the best in these parts, though don't tell him I said so. His head's already big enough to need a special hat." Lillian couldn't help but laugh, her first genuine moment of joy since arriving. Perhaps things wouldn't be as dire as she'd feared when the train pulled away, leaving her alone. After washing up and changing into a fresh dress, Lillian joined Mason and Mrs. Abernathy for supper. The stew was hearty and delicious, and despite her anxiety about her uncle, Lillian found herself relaxing in their company. "I'd like to see my uncle tomorrow, if possible," she said as they finished eating. Mason nodded. "I'll take you first thing in the morning. Doc Jenkins is taking good care of him, I promise." Later, as Lillian prepared for bed in the small room, she found herself thinking of Mason. There was something about him, a quiet strength and integrity that drew her. In Boston, she'd had suitors, of course, but none had made her feel this way after just one meeting. "Don't be foolish," she whispered to herself. "You barely know the man." Yet as she drifted off to sleep, it was Mason's storm-gray eyes and gentle hands that filled her dreams. Morning arrived with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee and bacon. Lillian dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a dark blue cotton that brought out the blue of her eyes. She pinned her honey blonde hair into a simple but neat arrangement, wishing she had more time to make herself presentable. When she emerged from her room, Mason was already at the table, deep in conversation with Mrs. Abernathy. He stood when he saw her, his eyes widening slightly. "Good morning, Miss Parker," he said. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you," she replied, suddenly shy under his gaze. After a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits that put any Boston hotel to shame, Mason helped Lillian onto his horse once more. This time, they rode into town side by side, Mason leading the horse by the reins as they walked. "Tell me about your uncle," Mason said as they made their way toward town. "I know him only as the owner of the general store." Lillian smiled, remembering the last time she'd seen her uncle, nearly 10 years ago when he'd visited Boston. "He's my father's brother. After my parents died last winter, he was kind enough to invite me to live with him. I don't know him well, but his letters were always warm." "Wallace is well liked in town," Mason assured her. "A fair businessman and generous when folks fall on hard times." The doctor's house was on the west end of town, a modest white building with a small sign indicating his profession. Mason helped Lillian dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "I'll wait out here," he said as they reached the door. "Give you some privacy with your uncle." Dr. Jenkins was a thin man with spectacles and a kindly manner. He led Lillian to a back room where her uncle lay on a narrow bed, his face flushed with fever. "Uncle Wallace," Lillian called softly, taking his hand. The man's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition. "Lillian, is that really you?" "Yes, Uncle. I arrived yesterday, but you were ill." Wallace Parker was a man in his 50s, his once robust frame now diminished by illness. He squeezed her hand weakly. "I'm so sorry I couldn't meet you. This fever came on suddenly." "Don't worry about that," she soothed. "Sheriff Blackwell was kind enough to offer me lodging until you recover." A smile tugged at Wallace's lips. "Mason's a good man, known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper." He closed his eyes, the brief conversation exhausting him. "You'll be safe with him, Doctor." Jenkins beckoned Lillian to the door. "Your uncle needs rest, but he's improving. The fever broke early this morning. With proper care, he should recover fully within a week or two." Relief washed over Lillian. "Thank you, Doctor. May I visit him again tomorrow?" "Of course." Short visits would be beneficial. When Lillian emerged from the doctor's house, Mason straightened from where he'd been leaning against a post. "How is he?" "Better, the doctor says. The fever broke this morning." Mason's smile lit up his face. "That's good news. Wallace is tough as old boots. He'll be back on his feet in no time." As they walked through town, Lillian became acutely aware of the glances and whispers that followed them. Mason seemed oblivious or unconcerned. "Would you like to see your uncle's store?" he asked. "It's just down the street." The general store was larger than Lillian had expected, with a wide array of goods from practical necessities to small luxuries. A young man was behind the counter, looking harried as he tried to manage several customers at once. "That's Luke, your uncle's assistant," Mason explained. "He's been trying to run the place alone since Wallace took ill." Lillian watched as Luke miscounted change and then fumbled with a bolt of fabric, dropping it onto the dusty floor. Without thinking, she moved forward. "May I help?" she asked, picking up the fabric and expertly refolding it. Luke looked at her with grateful surprise. "Are you Miss Parker?" Mr. Parker's niece. I am, she confirmed. And I worked in a dressmaker's shop in Boston. I know my way around fabrics and ledgers. For the next hour, Lillian helped Luke serve customers, her experience evident in her efficient movements and polite manner. Mason watched from the doorway, a small smile playing on his lips. When the last customer left, Luke turned to Lillian with obvious relief. Miss Parker, you're a godsend. Would you consider helping out while your uncle recovers? I'm afraid I'm in over my head. Lillian glanced at Mason, who gave a slight nod of encouragement. I'd be happy to help, she said. After all, this will be my home now, too. As they left the store, Mason's hand found the small of her back, guiding her through the busy sidewalk. You were impressive in there, he said. You have a natural way with people. Thank you, Lillian replied, warmed by his praise. In Boston, I handled most of the customer interactions at the shop where I worked. My employer said I had a knack for making people feel at ease. They stopped for lunch at the town's only restaurant, a small establishment called the Silver Spoon. The owner, a boisterous woman named Betty, made a fuss over introducing herself to Lillian. So you're Wallace's niece. We've heard so much about you, Betty said, setting down plates of fried chicken and potatoes. And already caught the eye of our handsome sheriff, I see. Mrs. McIntyre, Mason warned, though his tone was light. Betty winked at Lillian. Don't mind me, dear. Just an old woman who enjoys seeing young folks get along. By the time they returned to Mason's ranch that evening, Lillian was exhausted but content. She'd met what felt like half the town, all of whom had been welcoming once they learned she was Wallace Parker's niece. Over the next week, a routine developed. Each morning, Mason would take Lillian to visit her uncle, whose health improved steadily. Afterward, she would work at the store, quickly becoming indispensable to Luke, who admitted he had no head for numbers or customer service. In the evenings, Mason would collect her, and they would ride back to the ranch together. These rides became Lillian's favorite part of the day, as Mason told her stories about the town and its inhabitants, making her laugh with his dry wit. On Sunday, a week after her arrival, Mason suggested they take a different route home. There's something I'd like to show you, he said, leading his horse off the main trail and toward a stand of cottonwoods. They followed a small creek until they came to a clearing where the water pooled into a small, clear pond. Wildflowers dotted the grass, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, creating dappled patterns on the ground. It's beautiful, Lillian breathed, enchanted by the peaceful spot. Mason helped her down from the horse, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary. I found this place when I first moved here. I come here to think sometimes. And you're sharing it with me? Lillian asked, touched by the gesture. Mason's eyes, so often guarded, softened as they met hers. I've never brought anyone else here. They sat by the pond, talking as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Mason told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, losing his parents to a raid when he was 16, and making his way to Arizona 5 years ago. Lillian shared stories of her childhood in Boston, her parents' deaths, and her hopes for a new life in the West. As the light faded, Mason helped her to her feet. Standing close, he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers grazing her cheek. Lillian, he said softly, using her first name for the first time. I know we haven't known each other long, but the moment was broken by the distant sound of a gunshot, followed by shouts. Mason tensed, his hand automatically moving to the pistol at his hip. That came from the direction of town, he said, his expression shifting from tender to alert in an instant. We need to go. They rode hard back to Cottonwood Springs, finding a small crowd gathered outside the saloon. A man lay on the ground, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. "Sheriff," someone called as Mason dismounted. "Jed Thompson shot Frank Miller over a card game." Mason helped Lillian down quickly. "Stay here," he instructed before pushing through the crowd. Lillian watched as Mason took control of the situation, his authority evident in every movement. He sent someone for the doctor, calmed the onlookers, and arrested the shooter, all with a quiet competence that impressed her. It was nearly midnight by the time they returned to the ranch. Mrs. Abernathy had left a cold supper and a note saying she'd retired for the night. "I'm sorry our evening was interrupted," Mason said as they sat at the kitchen table, both too wired to sleep despite the late hour. "Don't apologize," Lillian replied. "I was impressed by how you handled everything." Mason's smile was tired but genuine. "It's not always so exciting. Mostly I break up bar fights and chase down the occasional cattle rustler. Still, it matters. You keep people safe." Lillian hesitated, then added, "You made me feel safe from the moment we met." Mason reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Lillian, what I was trying to say at the pond. I know it's fast, maybe too fast, but I've never felt this way about anyone before." Lillian's heart raced as she met his gaze. "I feel it too," she admitted. "In Boston, I would have considered it scandalously forward to say so after just a week, but everything feels different here." "Out here, life moves at its own pace," Mason said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Sometimes slow as molasses and sometimes—" He trailed off, his eyes never leaving hers. "Sometimes as quick as lightning," she finished for him. Neither could say who moved first, but suddenly they were standing, and Mason's hands were cradling her face as if she were made of the finest porcelain. His lips met hers in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened with a hunger that surprised them both. When they broke apart, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I should apologize for being so forward, but I can't bring myself to regret it." Lillian smiled, her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. "Nor can I." The next morning brought a return to routine, though the air between them was charged with new awareness. They rode to town together, Mason dropping her at the doctor's before continuing to his office. Wallace was sitting up in bed, his color much improved. "There's my favorite niece," he greeted her with a smile. "I'm your only niece, Uncle Wallace," she reminded him, kissing his cheek. "How are you finding Cottonwood Springs?" he asked as she settled into the chair beside his bed. "I like it very much," Lillian replied honestly. "The people have been kind, and I've been helping Luke at the store." Wallace nodded approvingly. "Luke mentioned you've been a tremendous help, said the customers love you." He studied her face. "And how are you finding your accommodations at the sheriff's ranch?" Lillian felt a blush creep up her neck. "Mrs. Abernathy has been very kind." "And Mason," Wallace prompted, a knowing glint in his eye. "Sheriff Blackwell has been a perfect gentleman," she said, perhaps a bit too quickly. Wallace chuckled. "I've known Mason since he arrived in town 5 years ago. Never seen him look at a woman the way he looks at you." "Uncle," Lillian protested, though secretly pleased. "I'm just saying," Wallace continued, "that Mason Blackwell is the finest man I know. If he's taken a shine to you, that's something worth considering." Dr. Jenkins arrived then, saving Lillian from having to respond. After examining Wallace, he declared that the older man could return home the following day, provided he continued to rest. "That's wonderful news," Lillian said, squeezing her uncle's hand. "I'll prepare your house today." As she left the doctor's, Lillian's steps were light with happiness. Her uncle was recovering, she had found purpose helping at the store, and Mason. The thought of him brought a warmth to her chest that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. The day passed quickly at the store. As closing time approached, Lillian was surprised to see not Mason but Mrs. Abernathy enter. "Mason asked me to fetch you, dear," the older woman explained. "There was some trouble with cattle rustlers out at the Peterson place. He'll be late getting back." Disappointment washed over Lillian, though she tried not to show it. "Of course. Thank you for coming." They walked together to Wallace's house, a modest dwelling behind the store. Lillian spent the next hour cleaning and airing out the rooms, preparing for her uncle's return. "You care for him, don't you?" Mrs. Abernathy asked suddenly as they made up the bed with fresh linens. "For my uncle, of course," Lillian replied, deliberately misunderstanding. Mrs. Abernathy gave her a look that said she wasn't fooled. "For Mason." Lillian smoothed the quilt, buying time. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone with eyes," Mrs. Abernathy said kindly. "And he cares for you too. I haven't seen him this happy since, well, ever." "We've known each other such a short time," Lillian said, voicing the doubt that nagged at her despite her feelings. "Time isn't always the best measure of these things," Mrs. Abernathy replied wisely. "My Henry proposed 2 weeks after we met, and we had 30 good years together before he passed." That night, Lillian dined alone with Mrs. Abernathy, Mason still absent. She tried not to worry, telling herself that his job often involved danger and he was clearly capable. Still, she found herself listening for the sound of hoofbeats long after she should have been asleep. It was nearly dawn when she heard a horse approach. Unable to resist, Lillian slipped from her bed and peered through the curtains. Mason dismounted wearily, his clothes dusty and his movements slow with exhaustion. Without thinking, Lillian threw a shawl around her shoulders and hurried outside. "Mason," he turned, surprised to see her. "Lillian, you should be asleep." "I was worried," she admitted, coming closer. In the pale pre-dawn light, she could see a bruise forming on his jaw. "You're hurt." Mason touched his face and winced. "It's nothing. One of the rustlers got in a lucky punch before I arrested him." "Come inside," she urged. "Let me clean that cut on your forehead." Too tired to argue, Mason followed her into the kitchen. Lillian lit a lamp and gathered water and clean cloths. As she gently cleaned the cut, Mason watched her face, his eyes soft despite his exhaustion. "You should have been a nurse," he murmured. "You have a healing touch." Lillian smiled. "I prefer fabrics to wounds, but I'm glad I can help." When she finished, her hand lingered on his cheek. Mason caught it in his own, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent shivers up her arm. "I missed you yesterday," he said quietly. "And I you," she admitted. For a long moment they stayed that way, connected by touch and gaze. Then Mason sighed, reluctantly releasing her hand. "We should both get some sleep," he said. Today, rather is going to be a busy day with your uncle coming home." Lillian nodded, though she was reluctant to break the moment. "Good night, Mason, or good morning, I suppose," he smiled tiredly. "Good dreams, Lillian." Later that day, Mason and Lillian helped Wallace settle back into his home. The older man was still weak but improving steadily, his spirits high as he reclaimed his space. "Now, Lillian," Wallace said as they sat down to a lunch Mrs. Abernathy had prepared, "I want you to know that this is your home too, for as long as you wish it to be." Lillian smiled, touched by his generosity. "Thank you, Uncle. I'm happy to be here." Wallace glanced between her and Mason, who was trying not to look too disappointed at the prospect of Lillian moving out of his ranch. "Of course, I'll understand if you have other arrangements you'd prefer." "Uncle," Lillian exclaimed, blushing furiously. Mason cleared his throat. "I should get back to the office. There's paperwork waiting after yesterday's arrests." He stood, nodding to Wallace. "Glad to see you on the mend, Wallace." "Mason," Wallace called as the sheriff reached the door. "Why don't you join us for supper tonight? Say around 6. Mason's eyes flicked to Lillian, who gave a small nod. "I'd be honored," he replied. After he left, Lillian turned to her uncle with a stern expression that was belied by the twinkle in her eye. "That was very transparent, Uncle Wallace." The older man shrugged, unrepentant. "Life's too short for games, my dear. I see the way you two look at each other. And if there's a better man than Mason Blackwell in this territory, I haven't met him." Lillian helped her uncle settle in for a nap, then spent the afternoon at the store. The routine was becoming familiar, and she found she enjoyed the work more than she had expected. The customers were friendly, often staying to chat and share town gossip. By closing time, Lillian was looking forward to the evening ahead with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. She hurried back to her uncle's house to prepare supper, choosing to make a beef stew that had been her mother's specialty. At precisely 6 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Lillian smoothed her skirts, checked her hair in the small mirror in the hallway, and opened the door to find Mason standing there, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt with a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. "For you," he said, offering the flowers. "I picked them on the way. They reminded me of your eyes." Lillian accepted them with a smile, charmed by the gesture. "They're beautiful. Thank you." Supper was a pleasant affair, with Wallace doing most of the talking, sharing stories of Mason's early days in Cottonwood Springs. Lillian learned that Mason had arrived with little more than his horse and the clothes on his back, taking odd jobs before being appointed deputy when the previous sheriff recognized his integrity and quick thinking. When old Sheriff Wilson retired, there wasn't even a vote needed, Wallace recounted. Everyone in town knew Mason was the man for the job. Mason looked embarrassed by the praise. "I just try to do right by the town." "And you do," Wallace assured him. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I find I'm more tired than I expected. I think I'll turn in early." He gave Lillian a meaningful look as he stood. "Perhaps Mason would like to see the garden out back. The evening air is quite pleasant." After Wallace had retired, Lillian led Mason to the small garden behind the house. Lanterns hung from tree branches, casting a warm glow over the space. "Your uncle isn't exactly subtle," Mason observed with a smile. Lillian laughed softly. "No, he isn't, but I appreciate his directness." They sat on a bench beneath an apple tree, close enough that their shoulders touched. For a moment, they were silent, enjoying the peaceful evening. "Lillian," Mason finally said, turning to face her. "I know we've only known each other a short time, but I feel like I've been waiting for you my whole life." Lillian's breath caught. "Mason, let me finish," he said gently. "I understand if you think it's too soon. I know in Boston things probably move at a different pace. But out here, we learn to recognize the good things when they come along and to hold onto them." He took her hands in his. "I'm not asking for promises yet, just a chance to court you properly with your uncle's blessing." Relief and joy washed over Lillian. "I would like that very much," she said softly. Mason's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and kissed her. Unlike their first kiss, this one was gentle, a promise rather than a passion. When they parted, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "Before your uncle sends out a search party." Lillian laughed. "He's probably watching from the window as we speak." Mason walked her to the door, kissing her hand in farewell. "Good night, Lillian." "Sweet dreams." "Good night, Mason." As Lillian prepared for bed that night, her heart felt fuller than it had in years. The loss of her parents had left a void that she'd thought would never heal, but somehow in this dusty Arizona town, she had found not just a new home but new hope. Over the next few weeks, Mason courted Lillian with a dedication that charmed both her and the townsfolk. He brought her small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry he'd ordered from back east, wildflowers gathered on his rides. They took Sunday afternoon rides to his special pond, where they would talk for hours about their hopes and dreams. Lillian learned that Mason had aspirations beyond being sheriff. He had been saving to buy more land, hoping to expand his small ranch into something substantial. "I don't mind being sheriff," he explained as they sat by the pond one sunny afternoon. "But someday I'd like to build something that lasts, something I could pass on to." He trailed off, a flush creeping up his neck. "To your children," Lillian supplied gently. Mason nodded, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Yes, to our children, perhaps." The words hung between them, a future painted in broad strokes but growing clearer by the day. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and golden light to the landscape, Lillian found herself more integrated into the life of Cottonwood Springs than she could have imagined. She had taken over much of the management of her uncle's store, freeing Wallace to focus on ordering and inventory, which he preferred. She had also made friends, particularly with the dressmaker, Eleanor Jenkins, who was the doctor's wife. Eleanor had been delighted to discover Lillian's skill with needle and thread, and they often spent evenings together working on special orders while sharing stories. "Mason's completely smitten with you," Eleanor observed one evening as they put the finishing touches on a wedding dress for a local girl. "Half the unmarried women in town were after him, but he never gave any of them a second glance." Lillian smiled, unable to hide her happiness. "He's a good man." "The best," Eleanor agreed. "And you're good for him. He used to be so serious all the time. Now he actually smiles when he makes his rounds." On a crisp October morning, Mason arrived at the store just as Lillian was opening up. His expression was troubled, and Lillian immediately knew something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked as he followed her inside. Mason ran a hand through his hair, a habit when he was concerned. "There's been trouble at the Harrison farm. John Harrison was found shot this morning." Lillian gasped. The Harrisons were a family who lived about 5 miles outside of town. "Is he?" "He's alive, but badly hurt. Doc Jenkins is with him now." Mason's jaw tightened. "It looks like the work of the Delgado gang. They've been causing trouble across the territory." "What will you do?" Lillian asked, fear gripping her heart. "I'm forming a posse to go after them. We leave within the hour." Mason took her hands in his. "I'll be gone for a few days at least." Lillian fought to keep her voice steady. "Be careful, Mason, please." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "I will. I have every reason to come back safe." When he kissed her goodbye, there was a desperation in it that frightened her. It felt too much like a final farewell. The days that followed were the longest of Lillian's life. She went through the motions at the store, trying to maintain a brave face, but her thoughts were constantly with Mason and the dangers he might be facing. On the 4th day, a rider came galloping into town, heading straight for the doctor's house. Lillian, who was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the store, felt her heart stop as she recognized one of the men who had ridden out with Mason. Abandoning her broom, she ran to intercept him. "What happened? Is Mason all right?" The man, Tom Peterson, looked grim. "There was a shootout. Sheriff took a bullet meant for me. Doc Jenkins needs to be ready. We're bringing him in now." Lillian's world narrowed to a pinpoint of fear. She ran to the doctor's house, arriving just as Eleanor was helping her husband prepare. "Mason's been shot," Lillian gasped. "They're bringing him in, doctor." Jenkins nodded grimly. "Eleanor, prepare the surgery. Miss Parker, I'll need your help. Are you up to it?" Lillian squared her shoulders. "I'll do whatever you need." 20 minutes later, Mason was carried into the doctor's house on a makeshift stretcher. His face was ashen, his shirt soaked with blood from a wound in his left shoulder. "Lillian," he whispered when he saw her, his voice weak but his eyes finding hers immediately. "I'm here," she said, taking his hand for a brief moment before Dr. Jenkins ushered her aside to begin his work. The next few hours were a blur of blood and fear as Dr. Jenkins worked to remove the bullet and repair the damage. Lillian assisted as best she could, following instructions mechanically while her heart threatened to beat out of her chest. Finally, Dr. Jenkins stepped back, wiping his brow. "He's lucky. The bullet missed anything vital, but he's lost a lot of blood. The next 24 hours will be critical." Lillian refused to leave Mason's side. She sat beside his bed through the night, bathing his fevered brow and praying with a fervor she hadn't felt since her parents' deaths. Sometime near dawn, his fever broke and he opened his eyes. "Am I dead?" he murmured. "Because I see an angel." Relief washed over Lillian in a wave so powerful she nearly collapsed. "You're very much alive, Mason Blackwell, and you had better stay that way." A weak smile touched his lips. "Yes, madam." Over the next week, Lillian split her time between the store and Mason's bedside. Wallace took over more of the store duties, insisting that Mason needed her more. "Besides," he added with a wink, "it's good practice for me. I'll need to manage on my own once you're married and living at the ranch." "Uncle," Lillian protested, though the idea warmed her heart. Mason recovered slowly but steadily. The members of the posse who had continued the pursuit returned with news that they had captured most of the Delgado gang, though a few, including the leader, had escaped. "They'll be back," Mason said grimly when he heard the news. "Ramon Delgado won't let this go." By the time Mason was strong enough to return to his ranch, November had arrived, bringing with it cooler temperatures and occasional frost. Dr. Jenkins insisted that Mason needed continued care, and to everyone's surprise, Wallace suggested that Lillian stay at the ranch to look after him, with Mrs. Abernathy as chaperone, of course. "People will talk," Lillian said, concerned about appearances. Wallace shrugged. "People always talk. But everyone in town knows you two are practically engaged already. It's just a matter of time before it's official." And so Lillian found herself back at Mason's ranch, this time as his nurse rather than his guest. As his strength returned, they spent long evenings by the fire, talking about the future they both now openly acknowledged they wanted to share. One evening, as the first snow of the season dusted the landscape, Mason asked Lillian to join him for a short ride. "Are you sure you're strong enough?" she asked, concerned. "For this, I would find strength if I were at death's door," he replied with a mysterious smile. They rode to Mason's special pond, now rimmed with ice but still beautiful in the fading light. Mason helped Lillian down from her horse, then knelt in the snow before her. "Lillian Parker," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. When I was shot, your face was what I held on to, what gave me the will to fight. I don't want to spend another day wondering if tomorrow is promised. I want to build a life with you right here if you'll have me." From his pocket, he produced a small ring, a delicate gold band set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Will you marry me, Lillian? Will you be my wife, the mother of my children, my partner in all things?" Tears filled Lillian's eyes, blurring her vision but not her certainty. "Yes, Mason. Yes, with all my heart." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to take her in his arms. Their kiss was a seal on the promise, tender and true. They were married on Christmas Eve, in the small church in Cottonwood Springs. The entire town turned out for the celebration, filling the church to capacity. Lillian wore a dress she and Alina had worked on in secret, a creation of ivory satin and lace that made Mason's eyes widen when he first saw her walking down the aisle on Wallace's arm. The reception was held at the town hall, decorated with evergreens and candles. There was dancing and feasting, laughter and a few happy tears. As the evening wound down, Mason led Lillian outside to where a sleigh waited, decorated with ribbons and bells. "For the bride," he said, helping her into the fur-lined seat. "To take you home." Home was the ranch, where Mason had been busy making improvements during his recovery. The small bedroom Lillian had used during her first stay had been transformed into a sewing room, complete with a new machine ordered from back east. The main bedroom now held a larger bed and a dressing table that had belonged to Mason's mother. "It's perfect," Lillian said as she explored their home with new eyes. "All of it." Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Mason traced the curve of Lillian's cheek with gentle fingers. "You remember that first day?" he asked softly. "When I found you alone at the train station," Lillian smiled at the memory. "I was so lost, so afraid. And now—" "Now I'm found," she whispered, resting her hand over his heart. "I'm home." The years that followed brought both joy and challenges to Mason and Lillian Blackwell. Their first child, a daughter they named Rose, was born the following November, with Wallace proudly taking on the role of doting grandfather. A son, James, followed 2 years later. Mason eventually handed over his sheriff's badge to his deputy, focusing on expanding the ranch as he'd always dreamed. Lillian continued to help at the store until Wallace finally retired, selling the business to Luke, who had proven himself a capable merchant under Lillian's guidance. Ramon Delgado did return, as Mason had predicted, but the town was ready. The ensuing confrontation ended with Delgado behind bars and Mason with a bullet graze on his arm that Lillian treated with stern admonishments about taking unnecessary risks. "I have a family to think about now," she reminded him as she bandaged his arm. "That's exactly why I had to help," Mason replied, pulling her into a one-armed embrace. "To keep you all safe." As Cottonwood Springs grew, so did the Blackwell Ranch. Mason's careful management and Lillian's shrewd business sense resulted in one of the most prosperous operations in the territory. They added a larger house as their family expanded, but kept the original structure as a reminder of where their life together had begun. On their 10th anniversary, Mason surprised Lillian with a trip back to their special pond, now a regular family picnic spot. As they sat watching their children play, Mason took Lillian's hand, the same hand he had reached for on that fateful day at the train station. "Any regrets?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners with the smile lines that had deepened over the years. Lillian looked around at the life they had built, their beautiful children, their thriving ranch, the love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. "Not a single one," she replied, leaning in to kiss the man who had taken her hand when she was alone and brought her home. "Not a single one,"